am. Thank you. Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. The Reservoir, the University of South Carolina Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and the illustrious Augusta Baker Endowed Chair, Dr. Nicole Cook, would like to welcome you to today's Mastering the Art of the Book Review with Stephanie SENDAULA. I'm Sierra Harris, a doctoral student at the University of South Carolina, and I will be your moderator for today's event. So before I get into the good stuff, the stuff that you're really here for, some quick housekeeping. This meeting will be recorded and the recording will be sent out to every registered guest. We just ask that you remain muted until the question and answer portion. And Stephanie will love to take all of your questions. We hope this is an immersive experience where you can take something back and apply it to your respective locations and institutions. Again, I'm your moderator, so feel free to reach out to me during the session, during the chat, and I will answer any of your questions. Let me turn on the closed captions right now while I'm thinking about it. Okay. So let's get into the good stuff. In the little bit of time that I've been able to get to know Stephanie, I am thoroughly impressed by how dedicated she is to our field. Stephanie is a librarian, writer, and educator who is especially passionate about the intersection of social justice and library and information science. She is the social media coordinator for the Reservoir and is especially focused on community engagement and outreach, all the things I love, and I'm pretty sure all of you all love as well. She received her MLIS from Drexel University and her BA from Temple University. So thank you again, Stephanie, and I'm going to pass it over to you.
Okay, great. Sounds good. Okay, and thank you everyone for sharing in the chat. It's just really nice to have, some, guidance on who has like experience and who doesn't. And if you don't have any reviewing experience, that's more than okay. We're happy to help you get started as well. So, and also feel free to chat throughout the, conversation. I'll be saving some time at the end for questions, but if you have anything that stands out, feel free to go ahead. Myself or Sierra or Dr. Cook will handle the questions and we'll go through all of it as well. So let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay. Everyone can see, right? Thumbs up. Yep. Okay. I see Dr. Cook nodding. Okay. And I see Abby. Thank you. So appreciate that, Abby. Okay. So if you don't know me, I'm Stephanie SENDAULA. I've been reviewing since about 2014. I was a review editor for a number of years, and I reviewed adult fiction and non with occasional YA. And now I also help Dr. Cook with the Reservoir, which is focused on youth books for children from children of color, marginalized communities. And I still love reviewing adult books as well. I love the art reviewing. It is a challenge, but it's also really fun. And also this will be recorded, as we said before, but if you have any questions afterwards, or just even like, something tomorrow pops up, feel free to tweet me. As you know, I'm always on Twitter if you follow me. And I see Michelle and Marie are laughing. I'm seriously always on Twitter. So feel free to tweet me or DM, I will respond. Also, I'm on Instagram a little bit less, but I will respond to my Instagram messages too at some verbiage. Okay, so let's get started. Yeah, and if you just came in and you missed anything, don't worry, this will be recorded. So you didn't miss a single thing, I promise. Okay, so I'm going to get started. So I think the first thing to keep in mind is reviewing is intimidating. I know a lot of people in the chat have said they haven't reviewed before, and honestly, reviewing is scary, like writing is scary. I had no idea where to begin when I first wrote my review. I just wrote a review that wasn't really that good, and I actually had to have one of my former coworkers help me out because I was like, what am I doing? And it's okay to ask yourself, what am I doing? It's okay to make mistakes. I mean, we're all going to make mistakes at times. And I think especially now, we shouldn't be hard on ourselves when we're making mistakes because we're all here to learn and grow and to improve. So that's my first thing is reviewing is intimidating. So if you haven't started yet, or if you've always wanted to, and you just haven't known where to begin, that's more than okay. Also, reviewing is subjective. So this is something, honestly, that I still struggle with, and it's really easy to lose track of this. We all have our own personal bias. As a Black woman, as a disabled woman, I'm always thinking, oh, there's a disabled character who was really cool, but it's a side character. But also that isn't the main point of the book. Sometimes the main point of the book is totally different. But in my mind, I'm like hung up on this one character and I can't let it go. And I'm realizing, wait, that's my own personal bias. And we all have bias. And I think in the aspect of reviewing, we need to be aware of that. And I will go through all the steps to help you kind of be aware of your own personal bias and to kind of like write reviews with a reader in mind, not with yourself in mind. And also, the last thing is you are enough. Be kind to yourself because this can be challenging. It can be frustrating. Honestly, sometimes I still don't like to have my writing edited by other people. Yeah, I'm actually going to admit that. I see people laughing because it is true. But sometimes it's scary to write something and then give it to someone else and know that they're going to take it apart and nitpick it because you worked so hard at it. And you're just really nervous. Still see people nodding. So like you guys all completely agree. So it's really scary, but just know that you are enough. And, if you write something and it isn't the best, you know what? Just keep writing. You can do it professionally. You can do it personally. I'll be talking a little bit about both personally and professionally writing. I actually still do both. I like writing reviews professionally for different review outlets, but honestly, writing for yourself is great because no one else can see it, and you're your own internal critic sometimes. So sometimes I'm like, well, you know what? This is it. I don't want anyone else to criticize my work other than me. So, which is like, a funny thing to think about, but it's true. So keep in mind that you are enough. So if you are second guessing yourself, I think as women, we do that a lot, especially. Just remember that, you can do this and you are enough. Okay, so let's get started. So why review? So reviewing professionally, a professional book review has two main aspects, which is summary and critique. And I think I'm going to get into more of the differences between the two later, but it is really hard sometimes to know how much summary and how much critique we should be focusing on. For me, sometimes I just like get in the mindset of like, oh, this book was great. I just want to write so much about it. I'm like glossing about it. And I keep writing this review and it's amazing. But also at the same time, I'm like, wait, my whole review is a glowing review. Did I offer enough summary? Does someone know what the book is actually about? Just me having like 8 sentences of praise? Is that really an actual review? And so I will get into more of that later too. And also sometimes it's just easy to do a bunch of summary because, almost like you kind of confuse it like a book report. Like a book report is more summary, just straightforward facts, one after the other. Whereas a review is more summary plus evaluation. So it's a combination of the two. So it can be easy to forget that we're reviewing critically. So it is a book review, not a book report. And specifically, book reviews are really designed for people who haven't read the book before. So when you're reviewing for a professional trade outlet, you are reviewing for someone who may or may not have even heard of the book before. And keeping that in mind as you review is also really important. So you're helping people like librarians, educators decide if they want to read the book or if they should purchase it for their collections and even promote it. So, and I see more people coming in. So, but just a reminder, this is being recorded, so you didn't miss anything. So feel free to watch this later. You can always catch up. Okay, so this is my usual rule of thumb. I found this great quote from Indiana University, and it says, there is, of course, no set formula, but a general rule of thumb is that the first 1/2 to 2/3 of the review should summarize the author's main ideas, and at least 1/3 should evaluate the book. And this is usually my guiding principle. And if you don't get a general guideline from wherever you're reviewing professionally, I would stick to this one. I would say the summary should be kind of like a good overview of the book. If you're telling a friend or like a family member, like, oh, this book is great. Like, what is it about? That's what you would put in your summary. And then the last part, the critique is, does this book work really well? Does it not? And we're going to get into how you can actually detail like what works and what doesn't. So, and I wouldn't overthink this either. So if you're stuck on something where it's like, well, it's mostly summary and only 2 sentences of critique, I wouldn't stress about it, to be honest. I think as long as you have a good, solid critique in there, whether it's positive or negative, you'll be okay. So I wouldn't stress out about if your formula is maybe a little bit more, a little bit less. So I wouldn't worry about it. Okay. And so when I'm reviewing, I think the main thing it helps is to one, know the author. Who is the author? Is it their first book? If not, what else have they written? Who do they usually write for? And this comes into mind a lot when you're considering a book by a children's author who's writing an adult cookbook for the first time, which happens a lot lately, or even like an adult nonfiction author writing a children's book for the first time. That's something I would keep in mind as I'm reviewing. And also you can mention that in the review if you like. You don't have to, but you can if that influences the review itself. And for this, I would say you don't necessarily need to know every single book the author has written, but just a kind of an overall guideline of what have they written before. General familiarity is really helpful in this case too. I'd also say know your audience. So you should match the style of who you're writing for. Is it straightforward, snarky, stylish? Are you writing for longer audience? Is it like, 600 words, 800 words, or are you writing really concise? So that really affects of how you're going to work on your review and get started. Because if you have more room to write, you can actually add more details into the review, where if it's really tiny, like 150 words, 200 words, you have to be really concise with it. So kind of know exactly who you're writing for and have that in mind. And if you're writing for yourself, none of this matters. So you can just, write as long as you want to. So that's really nice. If you're doing like a podcast, someone mentioned they're doing a blog for their workplace in the comments, you can write as long as you want, which is great. And you can add images. So that's, you can go all out with it, which I would really recommend, especially for like, audio or for visual for blogs. Definitely, I would add more for sure. Okay, so as you're reading the book, I would pay attention to themes. Are there themes in a book? Which themes are there? Do they stand out? Do you have to really read the book for a couple of chapters or even for like 100 pages before you get a sense of the theme? These are all things you could also mention in your review itself. And so also content. So this could be for fiction or non. So it's like for sci-fi fantasy, does it have maps? Does it have images? Etc. If it's like a history book, is there a bibliography and index? Is something that stands out, an appendix, an epilogue, etc.? Is there anything else that helps you get a better grasp of the content itself? Or if it's something that doesn't happen, for example, like a nonfiction book, is it missing an index? Is it something that should have been there, but that wasn't? That's something you could also keep in mind. Or is it something that you thought should have been there, but you're just like, well, if I wish this had more of an explanation of this, that would be helpful, which leads to the arguments aspect. Is the book making a good argument? Is it a nonfiction book like a history book that's making a good argument about its subject? Can you get a hold of the argument, or do you have to think about it and you're reading and you're just like, I don't know what this person is saying? You could even that could be something you could pay attention to. And that way I know someone's mentioned they're doing reader's advisory. You could even mention that, like this book has the argument's there, but it's kind of hard to get a hold of it. That's a good RA response too. And quotes. So quotes I'm kind of iffy about, to be honest, just because I tend to read a lot from advanced reader copies, which are ARCs. And so they're not always a final copy of the book. So I don't always include quotes in my reviews, but if you are reviewing from a finished copy, you're definitely welcome to include quotes. Because I think those would help with, something that stands out to you or what stands out to the reader, especially that you think would like to highlight in the book itself. So I think quotes are especially great for like memoirs, because it's like, you're reading something, you're just like, oh, that just really pops out. And it's really great for like reader's advisory as well. Okay, and I want to make sure if you have any questions, feel free to pop them in a chat. It's one reminder because, there's a lot of information, so don't hesitate to ask any questions. And so as you're writing your review, I would also keep in mind author qualifications here. Is someone qualified to write the book? And I think this is more like, if you have a cookbook again, is the person a chef, or is it, are they an aspiring chef, or is this their first time like cooking and they're just, trying to just see how it goes, which is also totally fair too. Or if it, a sports book, is it a sports writer writing it? Is it a longtime journalist? Like who is writing the book and what qualifications do they have? And honestly, if it's a debut, you can just say that like this person's interested in the subject. It's their first time writing about it. They're just, we all like to learn. We're all librarians here, I think, for the most part. So yeah, so curiosity is also like just a valid reason to write a book as well. So audience and purpose. So who is the audience for the book? I think this is something we don't always keep in mind when we're reading a book or even writing a review, but we need to think of who is the audience. And it may not be ourselves, to be honest. Like if I'm reviewing a YA book or even a children's book, I'm not always the intended audience. So I'm thinking as I'm reading the book, who is the audience and who would get the most out of this book? And that person may not be me, but that book may still have merit, and I can mention that in my review. And what is the purpose of this book? Does it highlight something specific, or is it just a book for fun? And books for fun are also still very valid too. A book doesn't need to have a purpose, to teach you anything. It can just exist as a means to just, have fun and like escape for a bit. So also title and format. So I think titles are kind of hit or miss for me because sometimes titles don't really mean anything, as some of you who have reviewed a while know, or even librarians, we know like titles don't always show what the book is about. So I would say, does the title mean much? I'm not entirely sure. You can mention the title is kind of confusing. You can say that in a review, or it doesn't really match up with what the book is about. But sometimes titles are more of a marketing aspect than anything else. So I wouldn't really take that into too much consideration personally. But format, so is it an audiobook? Is it a graphic novel? Is it a book in translation? Is it a book of poetry? Does the format work for this specific book? And if it does, you can mention that in the review. And if it doesn't, you could also say, well, this book, is in this format, but could also work better in this format, possibly. That's something you could also mention in your review. And publisher and price. So I know not every publication, takes this into consideration. These are things I do keep in mind. Is it a big four publisher? Is it an indie press? Is it an academic press? Like that kind of, factors into mind. Also the price, because, as librarians, we're always budget conscious. So is it a reference book that's, upwards of $100? Is it a cookbook that costs $49.99? Is it like, a history book that costs $35? So price is something we always keep in mind, just because we're always thinking about our budgets. So that is something you should keep in mind. If that's something that, you're really especially worried about, I would keep price in mind as well. So next, I would ask yourself, has the book achieved its goal? I mean, does the book have a goal, first of all? Because not every book has to have a set goal too. So a book can just exist. But has the book achieved which goal that it stated, if it has one? You could also mention that in your review, in the evaluation or the critique. What was included? Was anything left out? Was there something that you were hoping to see in this book that you didn't? And this is also really subjective. So for this, I would use specific examples. So if you're doing a history book and the book didn't include specific aspects of a war, what did they leave out? What would you like to see instead? What should have been included that wasn't included? Also, a really great comparison for fiction and non, and for adult and children, is how did this book compare to similar ones? Are there similar books in the topic? Does the book stand out? Is it groundbreaking? Is this book really similar to something else that was recently published? Could this book match in a set with like others of the same topic? Would it be good for book clubs possibly? Does it serve its intended audience? And so I want to caveat this because I want to add a mention for the word age appropriate, which I don't really always like to use because that can be very, very subjective. And I just saw a great Twitter thread about this too. So age appropriate can be kind of, really subjective in terms of who decides what's age appropriate. So if you're reviewing professionally, I would probably see how the publication chooses its age ratings and go from there before using words like age appropriate. But does it serve its intended audience? Is the book designed for an academic audience or a high school audience? You can mention that in a review and see if it does that really well too. And I think I also want to add a caveat here about trigger warnings. I kind of see those used a little too casually as well, where people would be like, oh, a trigger warning, there's a disabled person in this book. And I feel like we shouldn't put people's, actual identities as a trigger warning. So I think in that case, I think it's best to see the publication you're writing for, ask them how they do trigger warnings, if they do at all, and then go from there before adding your own and making your own decision based on that. So again, reviewing is very subjective, and keeping your own bias in mind would help to go a long way here. So common mistakes. So kind of what I was piggybacking on before. So take yourself out of the review as much as possible. I know this is very, very hard because we all have our own internal bias, but it's important to keep in mind a book review is not about you. So I want to emphasize that it's not about you as the writer. A book review is for the reader. So when we're reviewing and we're writing the review, we're thinking in mind, I'm not the intended audience for this review. The reader of the review is the intended audience. And that reader might be another librarian, and that's totally fine. but you are not your intended audience. So it's also important to be aware of the frequent I statements. So when we're writing, sometimes we're like, well, I love this book. I hated this book. I love this chapter. I love this map. And I think taking yourself out of the review means don't write, in first person. Don't use I all the time. Instead of saying, I love this book, you could say, the author did a great job doing this. So you're taking yourself out of it and refocusing the author instead. I know this is very, very hard. So it is a challenge when you're first writing a review to do this. So I would recommend maybe just trying like a few on your own and not even submitting them anywhere if you don't want to. You can just write on your own and maybe think about it. I like to come back a few days after I write my first initial review if you have time, if you're not on deadline, which is, I know, a big if, and then come back to it and then kind of rewrite and go from there. Just see if I can take myself out of it and try to refocus more on who is my intended audience. It's the reader of the publications that I'm writing for. Other common mistakes: a book does not need to be everything to everyone. This is also a really, really big issue that I see in book reviews, and it is really easy to fall into this trap. So I think one of the things we think of, well, I saw this book and like it didn't resonate with me. And it's like, well, it doesn't really have to, because books can resonate with other people and they don't need to resonate with me. And it's easy to think that everything should resonate with you personally, but it doesn't have to. So that's really one good thing to keep in mind, is our own internal bias, again, when we're reading and when we're writing. So other common mistakes, and honestly, I'm not going to judge. I fall into these sometimes too. So it's really, really easy to fall into both of these. So too much summary, too little critique. Too much summary, I think, happens when we're really kind of ambivalent about a book. We don't love it. We don't hate it. The book is fine. It's okay. I mean, I'm not upset that I read it. Would I read it again? Definitely not. I'm a rereader, so I do like to read again. But it's like, yeah, I read it. I'm done. It's fine. So I'm writing the review and I just write a lot of summary because I don't know what to say about it, because my critique is very like, meh, but I can't write that. So I have to, write something else instead. And I'm thinking, oh, this is all summary. So in this case, I kind of like to ask people I trust to look over my writing and say, hey, like, this book was fine. I think I might have too much summary here. Can you give me some input? So it is really easy to fall into this trap as well. And too much critique, too little summary, that often happens when we either love or hate a book. So when we love a book, we're gushing about it, we're raving about it for sentences on end, and we just end up with all this, great praise about it, but we don't really tell people what the book is about. And also when we don't like a book, we're just like, well, this didn't work. It was out of order, like nothing really, went well together, didn't understand it. So it's all this critique, but we don't really offer any summary of the book itself. So I think too much critique, too little summary happens when we either love or hate a book and there's no in between. And too much summary, too little critique happens when we're kind of more ambivalent. And it's really important for us to kind of step back and see why a book works and why it doesn't before we write the actual review. That would really help with both of these. So other mistakes, this isn't as common, but this is more common when an author is writing outside of their own comfort zone. So if you're, an author is writing sci-fi fantasy for the first time, and they usually write historical fiction, sometimes there's tangents, well, like, oh, this author has written this long-winded work of sci-fi fantasy that does this and this and this, which is, great to hear sometimes, but also it's more of a tangent about, the author itself. It doesn't really need to be in the review. I would say if you have space, if you're writing for a blog, you could include that. But if you're writing for, if you're on that, a tight deadline and you're writing for 250 word review, I would say leave it out. So same with tangent about the author, like, oh, this author has written several, praise award-winning cookbooks and is now turning their first time to this genre instead. Again, if you have space for that, that's fine. But if you don't have space, I would leave it out. So microaggressions in book reviews. And these happen a lot, but we don't always realize how much that they happen. And we don't always realize that they're microaggressions sometimes too. So I didn't connect with the characters. So for starters, we don't need to connect with every single character in a book. We can just read a book and we don't have to connect with anybody, but that doesn't mean that someone else won't connect with the characters. And that's okay. This happened specifically a lot for The Hate U Give a few years ago, where a lot of the reviews were like from white women, because a lot of white women do write more reviews than, everyone else, because reviewing is a primarily white industry, let's be honest. And people said, oh, I didn't connect with the characters. And to be honest, you don't have to connect with them. That doesn't really change the value of the book. And the book can still have merit, even if you don't connect with the characters themselves. So which leads to the next one. The characters are unrealistic, too much, or over the top. This is a very subjective statement because they're unrealistic according to who? According to you and your standards? Well, why are your standards more important than somebody else's? So are you saying they're too much for you personally? That might not be too much for somebody else though. So the names are too hard to pronounce or remember. So my first response to this would be non-white people have to remember names that are hard to pronounce for their entire lives. And we don't have the luxury of saying that we can't pronounce or remember these names. So the counterpoint in that is saying that something that's too hard to pronounce or remember isn't a valid critique, in my opinion. The same with the book has too much dialect, Spanish, AAVE, for those who don't know, African-American Vernacular English. So that, again, like some of the hate you give, I just think that's your own personal bias that you're reflecting onto the book itself. So again, taking yourself out of it, remembering that reviewing is not objective. We all have our own personal bias, but we can't let that bias impact how the book should be perceived in the real world and to other people, because the book still may have merit to people who aren't you. So I couldn't get past the accents. This is also one that I just don't think has any, validity, and because just because you couldn't get past them doesn't mean that someone else wouldn't. And again, why is your experience more valid than theirs? And lastly, the book didn't teach me anything. Books don't have to teach anyone anything, especially books by Black people, because this is usually targeted to books by Black authors, where this book, people would say, this book didn't teach me anything about being Black in America. And to be honest, a book doesn't need to teach you a single thing. It can just exist, and it can just, exist as a means of expression or of love or as friendship. It doesn't need to have trauma. It doesn't need to have, someone overcoming something or going through a hard or difficult time. A book can just live. So, it's a luxury to think that every, marginalized person's experience has to teach you something. So this comment especially really, is one that I just think you should rethink that. So if you're thinking, though, the book didn't teach me anything, ask yourself, why are you expecting someone else's personal experience to teach you something? Okay. And this leads me to my next quote, which I saw from UNC, which is great. I've seen this quote, in other aspects before, but this is a really, really good, succinct one. And it's review the book in front of you, not the book you wish the author had written. I see a lot in reviews where people would say, well, if I wrote this book, I would have written it this way. And honestly, that's lovely. That's great. But that's not what we're asking. You're reviewing the book as it is, not what you would have written. And honestly, I do, I'm not going to lie, I do this too. Sometimes I'm like, well, if it was me, I would have done this. But sometimes I just save that for my own personal reviewing, not for professional reviewing. I say, this is what I would have done better. Like I could have done this and this and this, and, I would have added these things. But yeah, but that's for me personally, not for, reviewing for professional reviewing. So you can and should point out shortcomings or failures, but don't criticize the book for not being something it was never intended to be. This is also a really good thing to keep in mind. It's a good reminder that, we do have our own personal opinions, but those opinions shouldn't outweigh what the book actually is. And, and they shouldn't outweigh that the book still has value and it still has merit to other people who may not be us. And that's totally fine. We may not be the intended audience for the book itself, but the book still could have value to other people who aren't us. And that's also something that we should be keeping in mind as we're reading and as we're writing as well. So writing negative reviews, this kind of leads back to what I was saying before of sometimes we think, I could have done all these things differently. And we do have to write negative reviews sometimes. And they are really hard. Like this is the part of reviewing that I think is the most work, because you don't want to just write a takedown, although that is sometimes fun just to write it and then just, write the takedown. And then you think wait, what's the best way to structure this so it's actually professional and fair and precise? But when you're doing that, don't rush to judgment though. So ask yourself, why are you writing a negative review? You can't just say you didn't connect with the characters, because you don't have to connect with the characters. So you can't just say, well, I didn't like the accents, because you don't have to like the accents. So ask yourself first, why exactly are you writing this negative review? What is it about the book specifically that, you just think doesn't make the mark. So use examples, be specific. If you're writing a history review, you can say, well, the book isn't comprehensive. It doesn't include this aspect or these years. And you could say, in this chapter, this isn't missing, this isn't making the mark. There's something missing here. They're like, like he is skipping the author is skipping a large portion of a critical piece in history that could have been expanded on in this subject. So be very, very specific when writing negative reviews, because that would help your case. And also that makes the review better for someone who's reading it. Because remember, because the review is for the reader. So that makes it better for the reader, because then they're saying, oh, okay, I got it. So the review, like, it's okay. The book is, okay, but it's missing this one exact part. Now I know. So if I'm buying the book anyways, then I could tell, my patrons that this book is missing this part. So remember, be specific with your examples when you're writing a negative review. This is for fiction and non. I think this is actually harder in fiction, because fiction can be much more subjective. Because if you're reading like a historical fiction novel and you're saying, well, like the language just wasn't quite there, the details were a little bit lacking, you have to kind of use like exact quotes sometimes, or you can just say, what is exactly that's just missing? So be really, really specific here as well. Just say, like, what exactly is this language not conveying? Is it too dense? Is it too flowery? Is there something specific that's just not really working? So point that out exactly, and that would help in your negative review. It will go a long way. And also be precise. So state your points carefully. So I would say, before I was saying, like, doing a takedown can be fun, but if you do an initial takedown, I would say write it first. And then if you have time, come back to it like a day later and then just refine it. Then you can like be precise, edit it down, see what your strongest critiques are, and keep that in. So you're stating everything carefully. So it isn't just one long rant, which I know it can be easy to fall into that, but just make sure it actually looks professional. That's, it's actually good for the reader, not for you, because the review is for the reader. Make sure that the review is still something the reader could benefit from, even if it's a negative review. And also negative reviews, do go back to the author as well. And I wouldn't say you have to keep the author's feelings in mind, but if you're writing a great critique, the author could read it and say, oh, I didn't do this part well. Okay, that's something for me to keep in mind as well. So I would say when you're writing a negative review, also, just be aware of that also. Okay, so next, and you can do it. I know this is hard, it's intimidating, it's a lot of information, but writing, especially writing for yourself and no one else, can be really fun. It can be really rewarding, especially now because it's a challenging time for everyone. It can help us learn and grow, and it can just help you improve your writing slowly but surely. And you can just do this on your own. You can do it in a journaling app, which I use. You can just choose any of your favorites. You can just write a little bit each day or a little bit each week. And you can do this just for not even publishing your reviews. You can just do this as your own personal, like, this book was a few sentences. This book was good. I liked this about it. I didn't like this, just to get started. You don't have to go. I wouldn't say just don't always jump into it right away. That's kind of like, it's a little bit too much, especially now. So I would say just start small. You can work your way into it. And there's nothing wrong with also putting it down and coming back later. You can say like, well, this isn't working for me right now. I just don't have the time or effort, or it's just too much. Come back 1 month, 2 months, even next year. There's no rush, there's no pressure. So just, on your own pace, you can learn how to do this. And as someone was saying in the comments, like, also like doing podcasts about this, blogging, they're all valid ways to review a book as well. So you don't have to necessarily write anything. There's all different ways that you can review a book and get that information out to your patrons. So other ideas that you can do, I love live tweeting books. I'm on Twitter a lot, as I already mentioned, and as many of you know who follow me. So live tweeting books is great. I'll just do like, maybe like start with a tweet for each chapter. And as you go along, you can do it over weeks or over the course of several months. You can engage other people. People can follow you as you go along. And honestly, even if people miss something initially, if you just keep adding to the thread, people will see it like, later on, and they'll just be like, oh, she's reading this book. This is fun. I'm just going to keep reading her review as she goes along. So this is one of my favorite ways to stay engaged too. Videos, book talk is great. I know there's a few book talkers here. It's just a great way to stay engaged with people. Videos are fun. They add immediacy. It's a great way to show off like the physical aspects of a book and how like pretty they are too. So that's also a great idea. If you like, if you really like video like I do. Also images. This is how I actually review books personally for my own personal benefit. So again, I use a note-taking app here. There's so many to choose from. You can choose your favorite. There's lots of different options for these. And you can just, as you go along, you can just, find an image, and whatever image pops up, it's like, this book makes me happy or sad or upset or frustrated. Just add an image that shows that emotion, and you can keep adding that as you go along. And since I like to reread fairly often, so I kind of like to go back, and when I'm reading it for the second time, I'm like, oh, what images did I use the first time? Do these same images stack up the second time? So that's a really great way to keep yourself on task as well. So, okay, and if you have any questions after the fact, or something popped up like tomorrow, next week, anytime, feel free to tweet me or on Instagram at some verbiage. So Twitter is SENDAULA. So, and I'm happy to answer any questions in the chat. So yeah, I just want to see. Okay. Yes, I'm seeing. Okay, I mentioned ARCs. So I get them directly from publishers or conferences or other sources. And I mentioned how writing reviews professionally. How did I get started? That's a great question. So ARCs I usually get directly from publishers. I get a lot of them from Edelweiss and NetGalley, which you can sign up for. As a librarian, you can usually get pretty good access to, sorry, I'm scrolling up for the more questions. Yeah, you can usually get pretty good access to reviews before they're published. I know someone else said NetGalley in the comments too. So yeah, so I usually get them from them directly. And writing reviews professionally, I started doing that when I was working at LJ, and then I got in the habit. I just really liked it, so that's why I got started. You can apply. There's so many places. People in the comments like Booklist, LJ, SLJ, PW. No Fly No Tights is great. There's so many places you can apply, and I would recommend places that pay, just because reviewing is an act of labor. So if you can get paid for your work, I'd strongly recommend it. I know that isn't always an option, but I would really recommend that too. Okay, so I'm looking, I'm looking at more comments. Michelle asked, what journaling app do I use? So I use a combination. I use Evernote and I use Google Keep. So I use Evernote for long form journaling for apps for just like miscellaneous photos, notes, etc. And I use Google Keep for very short term things of like, I just have a last minute thing that pops in my head, because Google Keep, if you haven't used it, it's more for like, spur of the moment type of things. So I use that for, oh, I have one sentence, I want to add this later. And then I use Evernote for everything longer, that's longer than a few paragraphs. Okay, yeah, I'm looking at Abby's question. How do I prioritize which issues to raise or elements to praise when there are others that won't fit into a brief review? That's a really tough question. And I would say the main thing is, if you're recommending a book to someone or not recommending it, what would you tell them? What stands out the most? That's what I would focus on. So if you're not sure, I would say kind of like a boilerplate, like this book is about these 3 things. And, if is there something that's like, groundbreaking about the book? Is there something that stands out about the book specifically? I would highlight that. Something that would, give you pause. I would highlight that specifically first before, going on to anything else. So I know it is really, really hard to be concise too. But I think a lot of things that we think might be necessary for a review aren't always. So, like secondary characters don't always need to be there. Details about maps don't always need to be there for sci-fi fantasy. I mean, it helps, but it isn't always necessary. So that's a good question too. So sorry, I'm just like scrolling down to see more comments. Yes, I agree. Someone says, Ryan says, Jess does great live tweeting of books. They really do. I recommend Twitter a lot. They live tweet books a lot and they're really amazing. And Chad says, RA for all. Yes, seconding RA for all. Becky does great thoughts on books. So thoughts on reviewing an edited book for academic audience. For example, would this format change how you consider the authors and editors' backgrounds? Yes, those books are actually really hard to review, in my opinion, just because edited collections are just really hard to review in general, because you're kind of reviewing so much information in usually a small amount of space as well. So for this, I would recommend, it's really, really hard to fit these in like 200, 250 words. So if you can, I would see if you can maybe have a little bit longer length, possibly. If that isn't possible, I would consider the strongest parts of an edited collection and I'll highlight those and maybe focus on ones that just stood out to you specifically, and also keep in mind the author's backgrounds as well. So is there a main editor specifically for the collection? There are 2 main editors. So I would keep that in mind. So yeah, so sorry. I'm looking for any other questions too. Oh yeah, no problem. Yeah, thank you for that question too. Yes, yeah, and also yeah, recommending, yeah, yes, CNRL, yes, good. Oh, sorry, scrolling down for one. Okay, can I speak to expectations that publishers might have for their reviews? Honestly, this is going to sound a little maybe ridiculous. Publishers love a review no matter if it's good or bad, to be honest, because reviews give a book exposure. So, I mean, I know they probably don't want me to admit that, but so you didn't hear that from me, but it's okay. But yeah, but honestly, a review is still exposure, no matter if it's good or bad. So I wouldn't stress about publisher expectations, to be honest, because just, the act of reviewing a book, I know, I think Robin Bradford's in a chat and she would say the same thing. Just the act of reviewing a book alone is giving a book publicity that it wouldn't have gotten otherwise. So, you just putting effort into the reviewing that book. Oh, sorry. If they have certain guidelines that they ask for, I would ask the publication that you're reviewing for directly. So yeah, because each publication has different guidelines. So yeah, so for that, I would ask to see what the publication guidelines are, because some have different guidelines than others. Some have different length requirements or, different requirements for what they want in the review specifically itself. So yeah, sorry, I interpreted that initially. So yeah. Okay, so I'm looking for more questions. Yeah, and I have another session in a couple of weeks about banned books. So feel free to sign up as well. So yes, thank you, Sierra, for posting that too. Yeah, so I'm making sure I didn't miss any questions here. Yeah, self-editing. Yeah, I do a lot of that as well. Okay. Do I think it's a good idea to write to publishers directly to ask for ARCs? I have done that, and honestly, I don't think it's a bad idea at all, to be honest. Just because they do like it when librarians promote books. So you're welcome to write to publishers directly, or even tweet at them too, or on Instagram. Because I know, yeah, that would be a really great way to get started with that also. So yeah, I want to make sure I didn't miss anyone else's questions. I think I covered. If I'm missing anything, just feel free to okay. Do I have suggestions about how to discuss the ways an academic book has been edited? Ooh, that's a really challenging one. So I would kind of look to see how many people edited it. Oh, yeah. Thanks, Chad. Yeah. So back to Ryan's question. I looked to see how many people edited the book. Was there 2 editors or 4? How many people were involved in the process? I would start there. And then I would see were the editors contributors as well? Sometimes they are, sometimes they aren't. So I'd also keep that in mind too. But I agree, Ryan, editing academic books is really, really tough. So yeah, that is a challenge too. And also for this, I would see if you can, maybe have some more length, more than, maybe more than 200 words, maybe more than 250, just because you do need time and space to talk about how academic books are edited. So yeah, Ryan, let me know if they answer your question too. Okay, yeah, great. Shelly, you don't have to be an official. So Shelly asked, do you have to be an official librarian to post paid book reviews? No, you definitely don't. I would recommend anyone, if you're just interested, go ahead and apply to be a book reviewer. You don't have to be a librarian. A lot of people are, but a lot of people are teachers. A lot of people are college professors who are just in their field. So you don't have to be a librarian at all. Yeah. Thank you guys for being. I know CNRL is word limit 700 words, which is great. So if you can write longer, that's amazing. So yeah. Oh, and I agree with Elizabeth. Yeah, I agree. If you're circ staff, you can definitely review as well. People ask me that fairly often. I would really encourage people, if they have, the time and if they have the energy, to review if they're circ staff, just because it is a really great way to stay up to date. And also, you're in the front line of books. You're in the front line of everything, really. So who has a better perspective than you to review these books? Definitely. Okay, another question, Ariana. How long does it take to usually write a review I'm satisfied with? I know this varies by person. So for me, honestly, I rewrite a lot. So usually I rewrite if I have time. I will write a review and I'll come back to it a few days later, like I mentioned. And this is only if I have time too. So I'll come back to it maybe 2 or 3 days later, and then I'll look at it maybe just to give it like a second edit. If I loved the book, I will kind of refine my praise a little bit just to make sure it isn't overly gushing, to make sure it isn't too much praise and not enough summary, like I mentioned before. And if I hated the book, then I'm going to make sure that it isn't like a straight takedown, that I have like enough balance of critique, that I just don't have, a rambling of like, oh, like, this long takedown, but not enough summary there too. So usually I do that. So it's a couple days later. And then I usually would ask like a trusted friend or someone, a coworker, to look over the review for me. And that usually takes about a day or so. If that, then it's usually done. So for me, it's usually about, I would say, less than a week. But I also feel like it's so easy to over edit yourself. And like, as Maria was saying in the chat earlier, we're our own worst critic. It's so easy to look at a review and say, I would have edited that. And I've done this before where like a review is going to print and I'm like, wait, can I change this one word? I just want to add this one last thing. And, it's fine. The review is fine as it is, but, you can be your own worst critic at times. And you're just thinking like, oh, this one, I can change this one exact word, this one sentence, flip this sentence. And it's so easy to second guess yourself all the time. So I would say it does vary, but for me, it's usually about a week or so from start to finish. But it does vary. And that's only if I have time. If I'm deadline, honestly, it's going to be like the same day, sad to say, which doesn't always happen, but that has happened before. So, yeah. Oh, Maria's suggestion is good of doing a draft initially. Yeah. Setting aside a few days later. Yep. So very, very good. Yeah. Analysis. Okay. How do I handle an editor rewriting the content of my review? That's a great question, Robin. With that, I would ask if I, am able to ask what they didn't like about it, why was it re-edited, or why was it edited harshly? Just because it is your writing and it is your byline. So I think you should be able to take control of what you're writing, and you should be able to say, like, I want to say this in my own words. And if they have pushback and they get upset about that, then that tells you all you need to know. So, I mean, I like it when people make my writing tighter, but if they're totally rewriting everything, then that's where it would cause concern. So it's a little fine line between actually like tightening your review specifically than people doing a whole rewrite of your words, entirely. So if it's a little rewriting, that's fine. But if it is, just like, more inserting their own personal bias, because editors have bias too, then I would question it. So, I like Chad's idea of doing a rough draft without paying attention to word count and then tightening it to get to word count. That's a really great way to approach it also. That's really, really good. Oh, okay. Thank you for re-upping Abby's question from earlier. Are there reviewers whose work I look up to and recommend? Are reviewers whose work I learned to from reading their reviews? Honestly, just a lot of people in it, this is going to sound really cheesy, like Maria and Chad in the comments. Just because I've worked with so many of you and like Abby for years, just seeing your reviews actually helps me become a better editor and become a better reviewer. Just because, sometimes you get in your own head a little bit as an editor when you're editing book reviews, because you just see so many of them and it's kind of easy to get, in your head and not really step outside yourself. And it's easier for me to be like, oh, well, like I'm doing the same thing day in and day out. Oh, yeah, no problem, Maria. Yeah, so it actually is like, I really do look forward to your reviews in all seriousness, just because seeing them, I'm like, oh, wait, Chad focused on this today. That's great that he picked up on that. It's, it's really amazing because I wouldn't have considered that in this review too, especially. So yeah, so I do like, your reviews specifically. I don't have a favorite reviewer of like a book critic in that aspect, just because I feel like book critics, like for the Times or for other outlets, they're kind of reviewing longer. They have like 1,000 words or so. So it isn't always the same as reviewing, like, where we're doing like 200, 250 words. So I think it's a little bit different. So, but yeah, so I do like seeing so many of your reviews, in the chat, or people who are in the chat who like, whoever reviewing for me, that's great. So, okay. The audiobook question. Okay. Is there a different approach to audiobooks if you discuss narrators? Yes. I think for audiobook reviews, I should have touched on this earlier, but I would also definitely discuss narrators in the review itself. Does the narrator's voice stand out? Is it easy to follow along with what they're saying? I mean, sometimes people just aren't really great narrators. You can mention that in the review too. Or if a person is like a new narrator and they're just, they're amazing. You're just drawn in the entire time. I'd mention that also. And I know for some people I've known who have reviewed for me, they review the book and then the audiobook as well, just to see if there's a comparison and see if one works better than the other. And you don't always have to do this, but if you have time, it'd be great to see a compare contrast of, does this book work better in audio than it does in, does it in print, or does it work better in print than audio? That's also something you could keep in mind. Oh, that's a great question too from Michelle. Does her tone mirror match the text? Yeah, that's a really great one too. Yeah, I also like comparing and contrasting print versus audio. I've gotten more into audio recently during the pandemic, so it is kind of nice to see like which books are working well for me in audio and which books are not really working well for me in print these days. Yeah, multiple voices is also, one thing you can also note. I think multiple voices can be kind of challenging depending on the subject and the book itself. So you can mention that. Is there one narrator, or there's several, a large cast with several narrators? So you can mention that as well in the review. Okay. Yeah, did I miss any other questions? I want to make sure I got everything. No, but yeah, I really appreciate the chat here too, because it's, it's been really helpful for me also. So sorry, I'm just scrolling back. So sorry for the, okay. Oh, yes. I just saw Abby's comment about Kelsey's. Kelsey's Bogan is a great person to follow on Twitter and TikTok. I do agree with age relevant as better than age appropriate for a descriptor. So I would definitely recommend that too. So good thing I caught that earlier. Yeah, I recommend following her on both TikTok and Twitter because she is my favorite TikTokers besides you, Abby. So just so you know, yeah, but yeah, Book Talk is great, and I recommend, if you can follow her there, because she's really good at challenging, our preconceived notions of what, what we should be doing in book reviews. So that's really good too. So yeah, so if anyone has more questions, I'm happy to, chat, but, feel free if anyone has to rush off, that's totally fine too. So, and again, this will be recorded, so you're always welcome to come back and, come back to it later. Yes, thank you. I'm glad that people found it helpful too. Yes, thank you, everyone.